Hi, my name is Stuart Weems and welcome to the Investably podcast. Our goal is to share easy to understand evidence-based holistic insights to help you master the game of building wealth. Okay, let's get into some questions. The first question is from Bob, and it was a really, really long email, which is not a criticism of Bob who wrote in, of course, just a bit difficult. I don't want to spend the next 10 minutes reading out the email to you. So I'm going to paraphrase. Bob passed on his thanks, of course. I shouldn't say of course, that's a bit arrogant, but as common that listeners do in terms of thanking me for the podcast, and he's making way through the back catalogue. And I think that's kind of a good thing about a podcast and the topics that I do. I try and make them, subjects that can be evergreen. They're not too time-based. So going back and listening to past episodes, hopefully they are still applicable today. Okay, let me paraphrase. Bob and his wife, 48 and 49, 3 kids, 2 in high school, 1 in primary school, setting up a private health practice as a sole trader with another clinician, as an employee, and a practice manager. So, Bob hasn't disclosed it, but I'm thinking like GP practice, that sort of thing. They've got 5 properties. So 1 that they're currently occupying and 4 investment properties, purchased their forever home in a beachside location in Melbourne a few years ago, mostly land value, and they want to build on that property and then move in. That's their long-term plan. And they would like to work for another sort of 10 years or so. Also have a family trust or some ownership in a family trust. When I say ownership, they're beneficiaries. So Bob is and his sister. They've got a property in there that they could redevelop. So the property is current market value is 1.7. It's mostly land value, and they could build a duplex on it and then potentially subdivide, split it into 2 trusts, Bob was saying, and still keep the property. Super balances are relatively small for their age, so 160 plus 210, so 380 in total, remembering they're nearly 50, so that's, on the lighter side in terms of balances, and mainly because they just started their investment journey, or they started their investment journey a little bit later in life, they admit, and they've been really focused on property. I should say the 5 properties they currently own, that's excluding this one in the family trust. Total value is 9.1 million, 3.8 million of debt, so about sort of 5-ish million of equity. So, they've done incredibly well. They're all in Melbourne. So, if they had been in Brisbane over the last 10 years, they would have done even better. 7 years, whatever, they would have done even better. But anyway, that's a really good start. And whilst their super balances are low, they're certainly off to the races in terms of building wealth at a total portfolio level. And really, if I paraphrase the kind of rest of the email, they're sort of just saying, well, what do we do with this property in the family trust? And also noting that they've got relatively low super. What are we going to do about that? And then lastly, we're going to end up with a large non-tax deductible home loan. So what do we do about that? They're kind of the big 3 planning matters in their situation. And to put some numbers around it, the property that they would like to move into it's currently investment property, currently has 1.7 of debt. They've got 650 of cash in the offset. So let's call it $1 million of debt. Now, if they're going to reno that house or demolish and rebuild, we might be talking about $1 to $2 more million to do that. Now, they could sell the current family home and that would fund most of that. So we're sort of talking, depending on the strategy around that, we're sort of talking somewhere between $1 million plus worth of non-tax deductible debt. That's the challenge with that is that's going to suck out a lot of cash flow over the next 10 years, where you really want to be focusing on super, and particularly from a taxation perspective, super would be attractive to focus on as well. So it's not unusual that you meet, or for us to meet, clients, and there's always a couple of really big decisions, big rocks, if you like, that you need to sort of work around and deal with. And having a long-term strategy gives you context. I've said this many, many times, gives you context for making these big decisions. So one of the challenges of answering these Q&As in this podcast is I haven't done all that work. I don't have that context. So I'm really reluctant to sort of say, well, this is what I think you should do A, B, C, and D, because I don't really know and I haven't done the work. But that's not very useful to you as listeners. So I guess I've got to, I've got to share some information. But what I'm saying, I guess, is that, and this is what I've said a few times, and the reason why I wrote the book is that I think education can get you so far if the next step is really obvious, but you do get to a point like where Bob and his family's at, that you need to then make some really big, substantial decisions in terms of what I'm going to do over the next 3 years with the property in the trust, with the home loan, with the fact that I've got too much wealth in my personal name and not enough in super. They're three big decisions. If you nail all those three decisions, in 10 years' time, you're miles in front. And so this is the situation where I would say, go and get some advice, go and pay for some advice. Now, that's easy for me to say because I'm a financial advisor. So, of course, I've got a vested interest in saying that. But, it's obvious, I think, for people listening that the outcome could be vastly different depending on the quality of those decisions. Okay, let me talk to some of them. So, some things that jump out at me are that Bob's self-employed, albeit, and he's doing that as a sole practitioner, sole trader in the medico space. So unfortunately, I can't really talk in detail about certain strategies because if I do that, the ATO, and they did many, many years ago, accused me of saying, well, that's just almost running a scheme because I'm just talking about strategies. So you can't really talk about strategies that help save tax because the ATO will say, by definition or by law, this is a scheme because it's predominantly to save tax. And, then they can, so it's a bit communist. They're sort of shutting down the ability for people to talk about that. But there certainly is a strategy that Bob could probably put in place to, convert his home loan into being tax deductible, at least tax deductible, at a much faster rate. And that's a bit of low hanging fruit. That's an easy one, I think. So in terms of strategies to get rid of the non-tax deductible debt, that needs to be part of the strategy. Of course, one thing could be just from surplus cash flow in terms of repaying from surplus cash flow. The other decision is, do you go and sell the previous home? And I note that Bob holds most of his properties in at least 4 out of 5 of those properties in a very similar location. So it doesn't give a lot of geographical diversification. He can obviously sell his current home and probably not pay any capital gains tax. I don't know if it has ever been rented out, but let's assume you pay no capital gains tax. So without having done any work on this, I would probably lean towards, look, sell the existing home, minimize the amount you need to borrow then to do the rebuild, and then you've got maybe $1 million of non-tax deductible debt. Put in place a structure that sees you recycle that to being deductible over the next, 4, 5, 6 years. And then because it's tax deductible, it's going to be more cost effective to repay because you're saving tax. So that you want to have a couple of strategies around that. Maybe there's a sell another property in 10 years' time, for instance, if those things haven't worked as expected. But that's how I would sort of deal with the home loan element to it. In terms of getting money into super, well, because your property's in Melbourne and because you can't sell them into your super fund or anything like that, I probably wouldn't. And you've done the hard work in terms of acquiring these assets, and you've got quite a bit of equity in many of those assets as well. I'd hang on to them, and I actually wouldn't do anything, and I wouldn't be too worried about super. But my strategy would be maybe in around sort of 10 years' time, which gives you, the full cycle to enjoy, the full next growth cycle, hopefully in Melbourne to enjoy. That's when I'd think about divesting. Maybe after you've retired, I'd be just a bit cautious around market timing and all these sorts of things. That's a little bit more important than potentially saving a little bit of capital gains tax. And you're not really going to save a lot of capital gains tax by delaying selling, I should say. If you sell while you're working versus sell when you're retired, the most you can save is like $35,000 in tax, which is not a small amount, of course, small amount of money, but relative to the potential gain, it's not going to move the dial very much. So I think just notionally, I'd say, okay, that's cool. I've got these assets. They're going to perform. And if you sell one to fund the home construction, then you've got 3 other investment properties. Look, you can sell them and gradually get that money into super. So I'm kind of okay with the super thing. Now let's talk about the trust. The property in the trust, remember that he kind of co-owns with his sister. He doesn't. It's in the trust. No one owns it until the trustee makes that election. But, just for all intents and purposes, they control that trust. And then the decision is what to do with this asset. Look, I mean, Bob talks about, potentially creating intergenerational wealth. The problem with creating intergenerational wealth when you've got a property in an entity like this is it's really inflexible. Doesn't really serve a lot of purposes. If you're going to create intergenerational wealth, I think it makes sense to have liquid assets because then you can distribute capital and income at times. So if you've got like a pool of assets worth $1 million, you might sell down some shares and give every beneficiary $100,000, for example. Maybe there's 5 beneficiaries, that's $500,000, but you get to keep the remaining 1.5 million in the trust and then let it build up again and accumulate. Whereas with a property, you're always going to have land tax, you're always going to have expenses. The income is not very predictable because of, lumpy expenses and so forth. So how does it really work? Does it work efficiently and effectively? So that's my concern around the intergenerational wealth thing. And also I would say that, well, if you want to create intergenerational wealth that occurs after you pass, then you can do that more effectively, possibly through your will, through testamentary trusts, getting money into super, making super distributions, those sorts of things. So I acknowledge it as a potential consideration, but I kind of put it aside. The other thing too is with construction costs rising more than 40% over the last 5 years, it really eats into the dynamics, the economics of redeveloping a property. So you've got to do the numbers to make sure whether it's worth your while. If you've already got the development approval to do that, then maybe you're actually just better off selling to a developer. And then you might put that money into the share market to create intergenerational wealth, but at least it gives you the flexibility to potentially use some of that money, use some of the income. It's going to give you a lot more flexibility. Whereas holding this lumpy asset and co-owning it with a sibling and then potentially having many family members manage that pool of money, that can be a real challenge. So coming back to the property though, you do the math. That will tell you whether there's any real advantage. And I'd be looking not at the income profile of the asset, I'd be looking at the capital value, so how much value do you create by doing that development, if anything? And that's what I'd probably guide, my decision making, remembering that it's going to be difficult to fund again because you're going to have to borrow to do the development. That gets kind of messy when you've got, multiple families involved. You'll have joint and severable liability across the loans, and so you end up having to guarantee each other's loans. That can be a problem from borrowing capacity. It's just a mess. My gut feeling is because you're changing the nature of the asset from something that's very land heavy to then something that has a lot more improvements relative to the land value, because you change the nature of the asset, it's probably not a good idea. And also, interestingly enough, construction costs have leveled out. I think they've grown about 1.3% over the last 2 years on average, although 40% over the last 5 years. That's not surprising. So we're probably going to see a level out of construction costs, which means you're not going to get the uplift. If you look at townhouses that were built 5 years ago, because the construction costs have lifted so much, the property is worth more. So both the land has appreciated and almost so has the improvements. We're not going to see that again. Oh, probably not unless we have another sort of COVID style event. So we're probably not going to see that again. We'll probably see it level out, in which case those improvements will depreciate, not appreciate, and that's going to pull back on the returns. So look, I think, what I think personally, I haven't done the numbers. If I was in your shoes, I'd probably sell the property in the trust. Remembering trusts attract a higher rate of land tax. I'd probably sell the property in a trust. I'd probably take my money and run, split it with your sister, put it towards maybe your home loan, sell your existing home that you live in, put it towards the build as well. That way you probably get rid of the non-tax deductible debt issue, free up cash flows so you can start putting as much of your money into super as possible. Hold on to the remaining 3 investment properties, probably sell them in 10 years over the next 10 to 20 years, getting that money inside super, and that probably works. But thanks for your question, Bob. I've taken 15 minutes to answer it, to ramble through it, but hopefully it's useful for people that are, in a similar situation to Bob, and good on you for the hard work that you've done in terms of putting yourself in that financial position where you have these opportunities to weigh up. Okay, next question is from Sally, which is a pseudonym. Not that that's that important to anyone that's listening. And I see Sally sent a follow-up, so maybe we missed her message. So if that's true, Sally, I apologise. Okay, Sally writes, what we say to a client who doesn't know when to stop accumulating? They've replaced their income and have no need to work. Imagine we replace their income with passive income. when there are many decades left to invest, if they're in their 30s, why limit themselves? I'm not saying continue until you fly to the corner store in a helicopter to buy milk, but if you could travel the world in luxury instead of budget accommodation, why not keep going and provide a better lifestyle for yourself and future generations? Would you stop and be happy, retired, in a 3-star hotel, or move the goalposts and turn apples into apple pie? So I wrote a blog called How Much Is Enough? And that is 358 for those people and it was sort of along these lines, I guess. Look, I'm a financial advisor, so my goal is to help people achieve their lifestyle and financial goals, but really financial goals are probably primarily just focused at achieving lifestyle goals. So really, as a financial advisor, that's my job. And certainly it's very interesting. I was having a conversation with a family member about this, in fact, last night, that it is very difficult to get people that are used to saving and investing all their life to change that pattern as they move into retirement, even if they have way more wealth than they'll ever need. And that's okay. I mean, that's kind of what made me write that episode, How Much Wealth Is Enough, episode 358. Because, I think it's about trying to get as much balance in your life as soon as possible. So this is kind of, I haven't ever spoken about the FIRE movement, financially independent, retire early. I've spoken a little bit about it on the Australian podcast, but I haven't spoken about it here. I might do something about it one day, but I mean, it's a personal decision, isn't it? That's what I think it is. Do you invest to your absolute capacity so that hopefully you get to enjoy a higher standard of living down the track and then potentially create intergenerational wealth? Or do you generate just what you need and then find a balance in life, like go and enjoy things? You might not be 5-star, but at least you're enjoying those sorts of things. I mean, what we know from research and from psychology is that experiences are much more important than stuff, right? So going buying a handbag or a couch or a bottle of wine, those sorts of things isn't in the long run doesn't create happiness. The other thing we know is the more you give humans, the less likely they are to be happy. Some of the happiest people in the world are those that don't have that much. And you've heard that people spoke about that previously. Anyone that spends a lot of time with many different billionaires knows that most of them are completely unhappy. So money doesn't equal happiness either. So more doesn't necessarily equal better. But it's a really good philosophical question. My personal stance on this is that I'm not happy with 3-star. I'd probably keep working to at least get 4, I think. I want to build a plan so that I've got a enjoyable standard of living, but I don't want to be the richest person in the grave. So, I want to then change to as soon as I'm comfortable, I've got enough, start giving some of that away. And then even before that, start spending a little bit more. And certainly over the last sort of 5-ish years, I've certainly been doing that, as in spending a little bit more on sort of lifestyle things, still assets, some still, appreciating assets, but more things that aren't just investments, saying art, those sorts of things that, you've got an asset there, you're not wasting the money, but certainly experience as well, holidays, those sorts of things. I don't know, I'm prattling on here, Sally, but it's a very, very good question, and I think it's really important for people to think about. And as I said, my observation is just be careful of the ingrained money habits that you accumulate. Some of these can be really good habits, is in spending as little as possible and investing everything, but those habits are difficult to break. But I guess at the end of the day, if you're happy, you're happy. But thanks for the question. Okay, next question. It actually comes from a comment from YouTube. So it's just ended up here because it's a longer question rather than an easy one to answer over on YouTube. And just for those that have submitted questions, I'm now up to questions received at the beginning of September. So 2 months behind. Apologies for that. But okay, let's have a look at this question. Question is, should I buy an investment property or dollar cost average into ETFs? So income 110, 29 years old, wife 90,000, 26 years old. Income should grow steadily. We've got 70,000 in super, may have kids in 5 years' time. Primary place of residence bought in start of this year. Standalone townhouse, 1.3 with a 840 loan against it. No plans to upgrade the primary place of residence. No other debt. 80,000 in offsets, so got a good buffer. 25,000 in equities, mainly ETFs and some crypto. And they were mainly leaning towards buying investment property because the leverage is still young and they can use the equity in their primary place of residence. But the mortgage broker said you can only borrow around 600,000 and don't think that's enough to buy an investment property. So what would I do? Option one is buy an older two bedroom, one bath unit in a block of less than 10 in a blue chip suburb. Number two, buy a house in Perth, outer suburbs. Option three, dollar cost average into ETFs, maybe via debt recycling, so there's borrowing against some of the equity in the home. And number four, just build up the primary place of residence offset balance. Some comments here is that Melbourne looks good value, but having all your eggs in one basket. And also there's no guarantee of mean reversion will happen in both location in terms of Melbourne and asset type in terms of units. Goal for my wife is to work part-time for 5 to 10 years, so would prefer not to be too negative cash flow by then. Note there's a chance we might move to Asia in 10 to 15 years and the current home would become an investment property if that makes any difference. Okay, really great question because I think a lot of people are in this sort of situation. And in a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to do an episode on, well, the heading of the episode is that the thesis of the episode is that if your budget is less than $1 million, you probably need to be an active property investor. And I don't want to steal my thunder, but what I'm really talking about is you need to think about not just letting the market do all the heavy lifting, but manufacture some equity. Anyway, I'm going to do that in, I think 17 December it's scheduled for. I haven't recorded the episode yet, so I can't share too much more beyond that. So what I wouldn't do is buy a house in Perth in the outer suburbs. I think 600,000 for a house in Perth is just not, you're just going to be too far in the middle of nowhere. I don't think it will give you much in the way of scarcity. So I wouldn't do that. Would I buy a 2-bedroom sort of investment grade apartment? Well, interestingly enough, there's a bit of data coming out that lower end of the market, so the below the median value is experiencing the highest growth into price growth. Well, that's no surprise because of the first home buyer incentives and everyone kind of predicted that. So we're sort of seeing that in the numbers now. So I think that will continue to sort of buoy that sector of the market, notwithstanding the fact that, it's intrinsically undervalued. But if you want some flexibility for your wife to reduce to part-time in 5 to 10 years, I'm not really sure an investment property fits into those goals, because the risk is that, interest rates are higher in 5 to 10 years and, you don't have the flexibility to make that decision. Putting all your surplus cash flow into the home loan and then say borrowing to invest in ETFs, that's a good strategy. But the thing I'd be thinking about here is, well, what ETFs are you going to invest in? As I've spoken about in previous episodes, just putting in a traditional market cap ETF fund doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But if it's just because of the concentration risk in the US with large cap technology stocks. But if it's well invested, that could certainly work. If your incomes, you made the comment, this person made the comment that incomes will rise, should grow steadily, then what I'd probably do is do the debt recycling in terms of, put all your cash flow into your home loan and then work out, how much you want to borrow to put in the share market. So for example, if you thought you could make 20,000 of extra repayments into your home loan, maybe what you do is do that and then get a separate investment loan and say invest $10,000 a year. So at least you're still making some substantial debt reduction. Or you might invest redraw, use the money, 20,000 to match those principal reductions. But using some debt to do that is tax effective because you're reducing your non-tax deductible loan, with the view to interrupting that strategy in a couple of years' time if your incomes increase and your borrowing capacity increases. So I think I'd buy an investment property as your next step, but whether you're there yet because of your borrowing capacity, maybe that's questionable. And in the meantime, maybe you should do the ETF strategy. And if worst case is in 3 years' time, you may need to sell down a little bit of that ETF portfolio to make that investment property transaction work, so be it. But if you think you're having kids in the next 5 years, just be careful about that decision. So that is, not be careful about having kids, but be careful about the timing. So, if you Say if you think it's sort of 3 to 5 years, then in 3 years' time, you've got to really consider when you want to get that investment property away and bed that down before you have kids. Because once you have kids, of course, it's going to be harder from a borrowing capacity perspective to be able to do that. But leverage is going to be your friend, given that you're not even 30 yet. And so, you want to build in more leverage into your strategy. It's just whether you want to do that. Now, I don't know if 600 is going to be enough really for a decent 2-bedroom apartment. If you're going to do an apartment and you are worried about the mean reversion, about apartments continuing to underperform, then what you want to do to mitigate that risk is level up in quality in terms of the apartment that you buy. So buy a big 2-bedroom apartment, something that is going to lend itself to work from home and these sorts of things. I think, if you get a high quality asset, you're much more likely to benefit from that mean reversion than an average quality asset. So I think you need a budget of 8, circa. That's what you need to be targeting. In the meantime, do the sort of debt recycling, invest in the ETFs. And if you do that well, you're certainly not going to lose money, or hopefully you don't lose money. There's no certainties here, but chances are. And then at least in a couple of years' time, if your incomes increase and maybe interest rates fall a little bit, you might be in that price point. Okay, next question is from someone that wants to remain anonymous. Probably a bit of an insight into how stupid I am. Quite often I read the whole question. It's at the end, most people say, oh, please call me this, or please don't say my name, or whatever. And then sometimes I've got to go and edit or re-record. Anyway, I've finally learnt from my mistakes. I read the end of the email before the beginning. Anyway, okay, so this person wants to remain anonymous. Firstly, thanks so much for producing a fantastic podcast. Consume hours of investing podcasts each week, and Investopoly is by far the best. So I like to hear that. I appreciate it. My question relates to defined benefit super schemes and how ProSolution plans around them. I know it's probably too niche for a full episode, but I hope you can cover your thoughts in a Q&A. My 2 questions are, how do you best plan around generational wealth transfer, noting that in most cases, defined benefit pensions do not extend to the generation? What's the best supporting investment option? Property, ETFs outside super, or contributing to a separate super account? I assume any would work, but there's options that are more complementary with defined benefit schemes. And number 2, will the purchasing power of a pension diminish over time? I realize pensions increase in line with CPI, but in your experience, is this enough to maintain purchasing power, or is additional investment required? Okay, so they're all really good questions, and maybe there is a specific podcast episode about defined benefit super schemes. And just for those listeners that don't really know what I'm talking about, there's 2 types of super products, or super accounts, if you like, what they call defined benefit or defined contribution. A defined contribution is your typical super product, which is, you put the money in, you get charged some fees, you get some earnings, you make some contributions, and that's how much super you accumulate, much like a bank account or investment account. That's defined contribution. Defined benefit is that your benefit when you retire is defined by a formula. And typically it's a formula of a multiple, and the multiple is dependent on years of service, times final average salary, typically is your last 3 years of salary, times by a factor, and that factor could be many things, determined by many things. Typically, it's whether you've worked full-time or part-time over that period of time. So, for example, if you work for us for the next 30 years, we're going to pay you 20 times your annual salary, or your final average salary, at the time that you finish employment. The benefit of defined benefit is that you have no market risk. Right? You just need your key to maximizing your benefit is working full time for as long as possible at that particular employer. And as long as you do that, you're going to get the benefit at the end of the day. They're not common anymore. Uni Super is probably the most popular or a well-known fund to have a defined benefit division. You want to get some really good advice about, particularly if you're young and you go into and you need to make a decision of whether you want to be in defined benefit or defined contribution. And I think at UniSuper, you've got a year to decide. From memory, don't quote don't quote me on that, but that's an interesting decision. There's a lot of defined benefit funds, and UniSuper has some divisions that fall into this category. There's a lot of defined benefit funds that are underfunded. So what that means is that those super funds don't have actually enough money to pay those benefits, and certainly the Commonwealth Super Scheme is one of those. So Commonwealth Government, and the reason for that is they were just too generous. So anyone with a very old defined benefit fund, not always, but typically it's not worth exiting because the benefits are good. Okay, so if I go back to this listener's question, how does it fit in with other assets? So we find that it's okay. So typically what we find is that one spouse will be in defined benefit, the other one's going to be in defined contribution, and there's going to be other assets that we're going to play around with. Property, could be shares in personal name, those sorts of things. And our approach is, because you're not taking any market risk on one spouse's super, you can probably then at a portfolio level afford to take a little bit more risk with the defined contribution spouse's super. So that is, go all high growth, for instance, on the basis that we're going to have this income stream and so forth. If we had both spouses in defined benefit, that you're right. Okay, so let me explain what happens to defined benefit. So some defined benefits, not all, will say once you reach that retirement age, that's what your benefit is, a multiple of final average salary. You can commute that benefit into an index pension. So you can kind of buy an annuity if you like, or you can take the money. And typically, a lot of those older ones, you would commute it into an index pension, which means that you are paid a set amount, typically indexed to CPI every year. So they might pay you $80,000 a year. Every year you get CPI on that. Those pensions are typically reversionary, which means they revert to the spouse upon death of the member, but they're not 100% reversionary, normally like 75% or something. So if you're getting $100,000 a year and then you die, your wife will get 75. And then if the wife dies, or when the wife dies, probably not if, when the wife dies, it disappears. And that's what this listener's getting at, in terms of it not being, it's a reversionary, but then it disappears. How does it create intergenerational wealth? So that's a risk. If I had both spouses, and I can't remember a time where I have, because it's kind of a unique situation, but if both spouses were in defined benefit, we would talk about things like intergenerational wealth, and that there's not going to be anything left behind, etc., etc. But normally there's a family home, those sorts of things, so it's not nothing. You might just have to be depending on the strength of the defined benefit fund, it's probably just something we have to live with, but not such a big deal. And I haven't come across it too much. So that's the way we kind of work with defined benefit, defined contribution. The second part of the question was, does CPI really work? Well, my parents are lucky enough to have a index pension, and they've been enjoying that for the last 15 years, and it's been pretty good. Like, in terms of, does it keep up with CPI? I mean, we've had a lot of inflation lately, right? It's pretty good. It gets you there, like, I think my answer is yes to it. It's not like the purchasing power really diminishes a lot more than that. They're pretty frugal people. Like, they don't go and waste a lot of money, and they've always been like that their whole life. But yeah, so I think it's fine from a CPI perspective. Anyway, short of time. Thanks so much for everyone for their questions. As I said, we're answering questions at the beginning of September now, and I'm recording this towards the end of November. So we are a little bit behind, but please, I'll be still recording episodes over Christmas, so hopefully get through more and more questions. Please keep them coming. And tomorrow I'm going to talk about fixed rates and mortgages and so forth. So when to fix your mortgage interest rate. And I'm going to share some interesting analysis that I've done in that regard. So that'll be tomorrow. Until then, bye for now. Just a few things before we wrap up, if I may. Of course, you can send me questions at questions@investopoly.com.au. But for a quicker response, feel free to add a comment on the episode's video over on YouTube. We have an Investopoly YouTube channel, and the link is in the show notes. I'm incredibly grateful for the 4.9 star rating on Apple with over 400 reviews. Thank you so much. If you can leave a review or rating, I'd love it, because I'd love to get over 1,000 reviews. That's kind of my target. Keep checking the show notes for free downloads, and I include book discounts there as well. And of course, if you're interested in working with my team and I've included a web link where you can find out a little bit more about what we do and get in touch with us. And of course, until next time, bye for now.